some of you, I'm sure. And I'm going to do a little woodland scene. And I'm just really going to sort of block out the forms and try to give you some tips for working with pen, brush, and ink. What I want to do is I'm going to create a part of edge of the woods. I'm going to quickly just work out the shapes that I want to work in. And what I'm going to do is have a couple different types of trees coming up with a base of moss and ferns. And we'll do this as sort of a pastoral scene. And I'm going to start by jumping in with my crappy brush. This is an old number 3 from France that served me well. But as you can see, it has lost its tip. This is a new brush here. And you can see I've still got a really very good point to work with on this brush. This brush has had its day as a precision instrument. Don't throw out your brushes, though, because it now has a new life in creating spastic patterns of black and white. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have one large birch tree coming up over here. And I'm going to start by laying in just some of the shadows. And I'm doing a little bit of dry brush. Now, I'm working with a paper that has a slight tooth to it. This is not a slick paper. And that means I can go in and do some dry brush. And dry brush means I'm getting, you can see how those patterns break up a little bit? Is that coming through on the projector? And this means that, I'll zoom in on that, that I can get this rougher texture working with a brush that is not super saturated with ink. And I can really create a texture that looks and feels a bit like birch bark. And the reason I laid in this heavy black here is this is going to be where we start to get the leaf patterns. So what I wanted to lay in right off the bat is the shadow falling on the upper part of this tree trunk. And I'm still working with dry brush technique to bang in some of these leaves. I'm just really creating rough leaf patterns. I'm not worrying about precision right now. I'm worrying about and creating large masses of black and white to sort of feel out how I want this drawing to come together. Now, even with that, I still got to be conscious of where the trunk is, and I don't want to lose track of that. And this is going to be a fairly impressionistic black and white piece that I'm going to be doing, but I will be getting into some crisper detail in a moment. Now, I've got another tree that I want to create this V shape with to pull the viewer's eye down to this area where I'm going to spend a bit more time on detail. And this one is not a birch. This one is going to be a conifer. That could be a pine, a spruce, you know, any conifer tree, and I'm going to work with very heavy blacks. And part of why I save these beat old brushes is I can really be rough on this brush. I don't have to worry about ruining it. I've already done that. But that makes it a really effective tool for this kind of drawing. Now, some conifer trees, again, I'm using a little bit of dry brush to create this texture for the bark. Some conifer trees will tend to have the older dead growth will splinter off toward the bottom of the tree, and it creates these interesting patterns where at one point in the tree's life, those branches went up, they sagged once they had their needles, and by the time they broke off and died, they tend to either go diagonally or horizontally off the tree. And that means I've got patterns I can work with where I'm basically working with a tree shape that begins with these lower limbs that are hanging down toward the ground and will make its way up to the live part of the tree. And I only brought in one beat brush today, but when I'm working at home in my studio, I've got a jar full of beat up brushes. And I have some brushes, I never throw out a brush. I have some brushes that are so ruined that they're perfect for conifer needles, where I can just soak them in ink and slam them face down on the paper, and it looks like pine needles. In this case, I didn't want to bring in a whole lot of brushes for this demo because it gets unwieldy and I don't want to make a mess of the CATV studio the way I make a mess of my home studio. So now what I'm going to do is emulate some of those shapes. And what I'm trying to do is create in this picture a fairly harmonious clash of different kinds of textures and patterns. And don't be afraid, especially when you're doing natural and woodland scenes. Part of the fun for me of drawing this stuff, I do not have the precision or the experience of the real masters of brush and ink like the Japanese masters, but there is that sense of play to it. Control is not the issue for me. Happy accident is the issue for me with this. And I've got a sense in my mind's eye of what I'd like this picture to resemble, but I don't have a firm picture in my head of what it's going to be. And that gives me a lot of room to play. It's more about that I do know where I want large masses of black and where I want some light areas to make this drawing work and to pull it all together. And that's what I'm going to be feeling out, and I'll try to articulate what I'm doing at each stage. Now, if I had my beat collection of brushes, there's 3 or 4 different brushes I'd be using to create these needles. Instead, what I'll do is once we get to the pen stage, I'll do some of that needle creation. But you can see, clearly these are 2 different kinds of trees. Deciduous tree versus conifer. Not versus like King Kong versus Godzilla, but you get the idea. All right, now down here, the focus of the picture, what I want to do is have a huge mossy overgrown stump here that broke off years ago, and I want to work with moss patterns. So I'm going to indicate as much as a shorthand for myself as anything. These are patterns that are going to require more careful delineation with my newer and better brush. All right, and now I'm going to go in, and I want this to be one of those like edges of a bank that you'll find in the woods where there's roots that hang down. And some of those roots I'm going to be doing as white against black. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm off the Richter scale. Always speak up when I start doing that, please, because I'm focusing on the board right now. Okay, and I want this to, here's the edge of this where these are roots now that are exposed. And okay, and now I'm going to go back up to this part of the drawing. And there's I love these kind of areas in the woods. If you're a hiker, you'll know what I'm talking about, where you'll just hit like these areas where it's all this dense undergrowth of ground pine and club moss and all kinds of interesting patterns and forms. And they tend to be down around the bases of trees. And this, being a birch, has a different kind of root pattern. And I want to indicate that some of that root pattern is exposed. I'll tighten that up in the drawing. Whereas with the conifer, I don't really care. The conifer is all going to be in shadow. And I really want that to be a very primal shape. So I'm just going to lay in this part of the drawing with heavy black. And this is where I'm going to pay particular attention, once I get into the finer work, to doing some more precise fern patterns and build on what I showed you and we talked about with that last sketchier drawing. Okay, now I'm going to bang this in, and I want a big area of black down here.
Steve, how much of what you kind of know about all the forest stuff is from research, and how much of it is just from walking through the woods and hiking like you said?
Those are good questions. A lot of it comes out of walking around and just enjoying being out in the woods. I mean, one of the things I did with many of you, Center for Cartoon Studies, is back in the fall, we took a trip up Mount Ascutney and wandered around the top for about 3 or 4 hours. And part of it was I was just hoping to steep some of you in experiencing that aspect of nature, just sort of wandering around, looking at what's there. So a lot of it for me, long term, is a lifetime growing up in Vermont of enjoying those kind of wanderings. The research part comes twofold. I do read about this stuff.